What if I told you that the man who helped seal America's victory in the Revolution was not American at all, and that he was just 19 years old when he crossed an ocean to fight for a country he had never even visited? Picture this. The fields outside Yorktown, Virginia, in the autumn of 1781. British cannons are going silent one by one. French warships have locked down the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off every possible escape route by sea. American and French artillery have been pounding the British fortifications day and night without mercy, and the most powerful military empire on the planet is finally running out of options. And standing at the point that blocks the last land escape route across the York River is a 24-year-old Frenchman who, just 5 years earlier, had never fired a single shot in combat. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found us, and I hope you will stick around and hit that subscribe button because we cover stories like this one every single week. Stories that history class never had time for. Stories about the people who shaped this nation in ways most of us have never fully appreciated. Now, I want you to think about what I just described for a moment. A young French nobleman, wealthy beyond imagination, connected to the most powerful family in all of France, with every comfort and privilege the 18th century could possibly offer, chose to walk away from all of it. He defied a direct royal order from his own king. He abandoned his pregnant wife. He bought his own ship with his own money, sailed nearly 4,000 miles across the open Atlantic, and showed up on American soil to fight for a cause that most of Europe considered already lost. The question I keep coming back to is this: what makes a person do something like that? What combination of grief, conviction, and sheer courage drives a teenager to risk everything, including imprisonment, disgrace, and death, for a revolution happening in a country he had never set foot in, spoken in a language he barely understood? That is exactly what we are going to explore today. Because the story of this young Frenchman is not just a history lesson. It is one of the most remarkable examples of personal courage and unshakable conviction that I have ever come across. And I think by the time we reach the end, you are going to feel the same way. To understand why this young Frenchman did what he did, you have to go back to the very beginning, because the forces that shaped him started working long before he ever heard the word America. He was born in 1757 into one of the oldest noble families in France, inheriting a castle, a title, and a fortune that most people could not even dream of. But here is the part that most history books gloss over. By the time he was 13 years old, he had already lost everything that actually mattered. His father, a colonel in the French military, was killed by a British cannonball at the Battle of Minden in 1759 when this boy was just 2 years old. His mother died when he was 13, and his grandfather passed shortly after. So by the time he reached his teenage years, he was sitting on top of an enormous inherited wealth, one of the richest young men in all of France, and yet he was completely alone in the world. That wound, especially the one left by a British cannonball that took his father, never healed. And that matters more than almost anything else in this story. At 14, he enrolled in the Royal Military Academy in Versailles. At 16, he married into one of the most powerful and well-connected families in the entire French aristocracy, families with direct ties to the court of King Louis XVI. By every standard of 18th century aristocratic life, this young man had already won. He had money, connections, a commission as a cavalry officer, and a future mapped out in gilded comfort. He could have spent the rest of his days at masked balls in Versailles, hunting on country estates, and slowly climbing the ranks of a peacetime army without ever once breaking a sweat. But something happened in August of 1775 that changed the entire trajectory of his life, and this is a detail that most people never hear. He attended a dinner party where the Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of King George III of England, was the guest of honor. The Duke, frustrated with his own royal brother, openly praised the American colonists who had just begun their rebellion at Lexington and Concord. and something ignited inside this young French nobleman that night. He later wrote, and I want you to hear these exact words. From that hour, I could think of nothing but this enterprise. That was the spark. Not a grand political speech, not a battlefield victory. Just a dinner conversation that set a 17-year-old on a collision course with history. By late 1776, whispers about the American Revolution were spreading through every salon and drawing room in Paris. Philosophers had been writing about liberty and self-governance for decades, and now a real rebellion was putting those ideas into practice across the Atlantic. For a young officer who hated the British with every fiber of his being and who craved a purpose larger than peacetime parades, this was simply irresistible. He sought out Silas Deane, an American diplomat secretly recruiting European officers for the Continental Army. Deane was desperate. The Americans were losing badly. Washington's forces had been battered in New York. Morale was collapsing. Deane needed experienced soldiers. This young man had almost no combat experience, but he had something Deane needed just as urgently. He had personal wealth, aristocratic connections, and a famous name that could embarrass the British Empire on the world stage. He volunteered to serve entirely at his own expense, without salary, without demanding a command. Deane offered him an honorary commission as a major general in the Continental Army. He accepted on the spot, at 19 years old. And then the obstacles started stacking up fast. King Louis XVI issued a direct order forbidding him from leaving France. His pregnant wife begged him to stay. His in-laws were horrified. The royal court expected obedience. He responded by purchasing a merchant vessel called La Victoire for approximately 200,000 livres, sneaking south to a Spanish port near the French border to avoid arrest, and on April 20th, 1777, setting sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Think about that for a second. A 19-year-old bought his own ship to join a revolution on another continent, in a language he barely understood, for a cause most of Europe had already written off. The crossing took nearly 2 months. The ship handled the open Atlantic about as well as you would expect a merchant vessel to handle it. He spent weeks seasick below deck while the British Navy patrolled the shipping lanes all around them. One encounter with a Royal Navy frigate and the whole adventure ends before it begins, with him in chains, headed back to a French prison for defying his king. But he made it. He landed near Yorktown, South Carolina. On the 13th of June, 1777, stepped onto American soil for the very first time, and immediately discovered that the hero's welcome he might have imagined was absolutely not waiting for him. And what happened next is where this story really starts to get interesting. When he arrived at the doors of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the reception was almost insulting. Congress was already overwhelmed with European volunteers showing up and demanding high ranks, fat salaries, and commands over American troops they had never met. Most delegates barely looked up when another foreign officer walked through the door. But this young Frenchman did something that none of the others had done. He offered to serve as a volunteer without pay, without demanding a command, without asking for anything except the chance to fight. That single gesture changed everything. Congress approved his commission on the 31st of July, 1777, making him a major general at 19 years old. And then, just days later, on August 5th, he met George Washington for the first time at a dinner in Philadelphia. And I want you to understand what that moment actually looked like, because it tells you everything about why these two men clicked the way they did. Washington was 45 years old, exhausted, and leading an army that was outgunned, underfunded, and losing badly. This young Frenchman was 19, wide-eyed, and radiating a kind of enthusiasm for the American cause that Washington had not seen in a long time. On paper, they had absolutely nothing in common. But beneath the surface, the connection was almost immediate, and it ran deeper than either man probably expected. Washington had lost his own father when he was young. This young man had lost both parents before he turned 14. Washington had no surviving biological sons. And this teenager, whether he fully understood it or not, was searching for a father figure to replace the one a British cannonball had taken from him when he was 2 years old. That bond became one of the most remarkable relationships in all of American history, part mentorship, part father and son, and part military partnership that would prove decisive at the most critical moments of the war. In fact, years later, he would name his only son George's Washington, after the man who had become the closest thing to a father he had ever known. Washington brought him into his personal staff, took him to strategy meetings, introduced him to senior officers, and essentially began teaching him everything he needed to know about American warfare and American politics. Less than 6 weeks after arriving, this young man got his first real taste of combat. And it nearly killed him. On the 11th of September 1777, the British Army, under General William Howe, launched a flanking attack on Washington's forces at the Battle of Brandywine in Pennsylvania. The American right flank collapsed into chaos. Troops were retreating in every direction. He had been assigned only to observe, but he rode directly into the fighting anyway, rallied retreating soldiers, and tried to organize a defensive line against the advancing British. During the chaos, a musket ball tore through his left calf. His aides urged him to leave the field immediately. He refused. He stayed on his horse, kept directing troops, and helped organize an orderly retreat that prevented a complete rout. Only after the American forces had pulled back to safety did he allow anyone to treat his wound. Washington reportedly told the surgeons to treat him as if he were his own son, and that was not a figure of speech. He actually said those words. The wound took months to heal. But by December, he was back, just in time for what I consider the most defining chapter of the entire Revolutionary War. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the winter of 1777 to 1778. Now here is something that most people do not know, and I think it actually makes the story even more powerful. That winter was not, historically speaking, an unusually harsh one. Historians classify it as relatively mild. The camp recorded fewer than 10 days of appreciable snowfall. What actually destroyed men at Valley Forge was not a blizzard. It was mud, disease, overcrowding, and a catastrophic failure of the supply chain. Roughly 12,000 soldiers marched into that camp in mid-December, and approximately 2,000 of them never walked out. That death toll was higher than the casualty count from any single battle of the entire Revolutionary War. And here is the detail that hits hardest. 2/3 of those deaths happened in the warmer months of March, April, and May, when food supplies had actually improved, but influenza, typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery were tearing through the overcrowded huts like wildfire. This young Frenchman could have been sleeping in a feather bed in one of the grandest chateaux in France. Instead, he chose to stay. He shared the conditions with the men around him. He used his own personal money to buy supplies for soldiers he had known for only a few months. He walked through the freezing mud, talking to men, eating the same meager rations they ate, sitting with them in the darkness when there was nothing else to offer. In a war where many officers lived in relative comfort while their men suffered, that willingness to endure the same misery as the lowest private in the camp earned him a loyalty that no title or commission could have ever purchased. But the cold and the starvation were not even the most dangerous threat he faced that winter. Because while the army was slowly dying in those frozen hills, a political conspiracy was forming inside the Continental Congress aimed directly at removing George Washington from command. A group of officers and politicians, frustrated by the string of defeats, began secretly plotting to replace Washington with General Horatio Gates, the hero of the recent American victory at Saratoga. This scheme became known as the Conway Cabal, and the conspirators came to this young Frenchman with an offer. They dangled a major independent command in front of him, leadership of an invasion of Canada, hoping that separating him from Washington would weaken the commander's inner circle. He accepted the command, and then he immediately wrote to Washington, swearing his personal loyalty and exposing the entire plot. The Canadian expedition turned out to be a logistical disaster with barely enough troops to fill a tavern. He pulled back, publicly humiliated the planners, and used their failure to reinforce Washington's position. Think about what that decision actually meant. If he had sided with the conspirators, Washington might have lost his command. The Continental Army might have fractured beyond repair. And the entire revolution could have collapsed before France ever sent a single soldier to help. One young man's loyalty, tested at exactly the right moment, may have saved the whole thing. By the spring of 1778, something had shifted. This young Frenchman had proven himself not just as a soldier willing to bleed, but as a strategic mind sharp enough to outmaneuver seasoned British commanders. At the Battle of Barren Hill in May of 1778, he led roughly 2,000 men into a forward position near Philadelphia that was almost completely encircled by a much larger British force. General Howe had designed the trap personally, expecting to capture this famous young Frenchman and deliver a humiliating blow to the American cause. But he spotted the trap before it closed, maneuvered his entire force through a narrow escape route along the Schuylkill River, and pulled off a clean retreat without losing a single man. General Howe reportedly threw his hat on the ground in pure frustration. A 20-year-old had just outfoxed one of the most experienced commanders in the British Army. And at that moment, the American leadership began to realize something important. His value was not limited to what he could do on a battlefield. His connections to the French court might be worth more than any military victory he could win in Pennsylvania. So in January of 1779, he sailed back to France. And the transformation was stunning. He did not return as the impulsive teenager who had snuck away against the king's orders 2 years earlier. He returned as a wounded war hero, a young nobleman who had crossed an ocean, taken a musket ball in the leg, survived Valley Forge, and bled for the ideals of American liberty. The French public could not get enough of him. He was treated like a celebrity in every salon and drawing room in Paris. And more importantly, he had direct personal access to King Louis XVI and his ministers. He lobbied aggressively and relentlessly. He attended meetings at Versailles. He dined with foreign ministers. He met with the king himself on multiple occasions, painting a vivid and urgent picture of the American struggle. And he worked side by side with Benjamin Franklin, who was already in Paris as the American ambassador. Franklin brought the intellectual gravitas and diplomatic precision. This young man brought the emotional urgency of someone who had actually fought and bled on that ground. Together they pushed for French troops, French warships, French money, and French military leadership on American soil. And it worked. By 1780, King Louis sent General Rochambeau with roughly 6,000 professional French soldiers to America, along with a major naval fleet under Admiral de Grasse. Washington himself later acknowledged that without this French intervention, the American Revolution almost certainly would have failed. And this young Frenchman was one of the central reasons that intervention happened when it did. He returned to America in the spring of 1780, and was given command of American forces in Virginia. His assignment was to contain the British Army under General Charles Cornwallis, who was raiding across the Virginia countryside with a force of roughly 7,000 battle-hardened regulars. The problem was that he had only about 3,000 men, many of them poorly trained militia, who could not be expected to hold a line against disciplined British infantry in an open engagement. A direct confrontation would have been suicide. So instead, he did something far more intelligent. He turned the entire campaign into a game of patience and psychological pressure. He shadowed Cornwallis across Virginia, staying close enough to slow him down and disrupt his supply lines, but always refusing to commit to the kind of pitched battle where British discipline would have destroyed him. Every time Cornwallis turned to fight, he pulled back. Every time Cornwallis turned away, he followed. Cornwallis reportedly wrote that the boy could not escape him. But the boy kept slipping away, kept his army intact, and kept Cornwallis pinned in Virginia long enough for the real trap to take shape around him, a trap so perfectly coordinated that it would require everything to go right at exactly the right moment. In the summer of 1781, Washington and Rochambeau made the decisive call. They would march their combined forces south from New York to Virginia and attempt to surround Cornwallis at Yorktown. Simultaneously, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet was sailing north from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay. In early September, de Grasse's fleet defeated the British naval force at the Battle of the Chesapeake, sealing off the bay completely. Cornwallis could no longer be reinforced or evacuated by sea. Washington and Rochambeau arrived with their combined armies, and the forces under this young Frenchman locked down Gloucester Point, cutting off the last possible land escape route across the York River. Cornwallis was completely surrounded. Roughly 17,000 American and French troops began the formal siege, digging parallel trenches that crept closer and closer to the British lines day by day. When the bombardment began on the 9th of October 1781, the effect was devastating. Cornwallis had 65 cannons inside his fortifications. He found himself under close-range fire from 92 guns. The British soldiers could not sleep, could not move safely between positions, and could barely man their own guns without being cut down. On the night of October 14th, 2 assault columns moved out in the darkness. American troops under Colonel Alexander Hamilton stormed Redoubt 10 with fixed bayonets and explicit orders not to load their muskets, to prevent any accidental shot from giving away the attack before they reached the walls. The assault lasted roughly 10 minutes. The French simultaneously stormed Redoubt 9. With both positions gone, the Allied artillery could fire directly into the heart of the British defenses from every angle. Cornwallis had nowhere left to go. And here is a detail that I find deeply revealing about the character of the man who had been defeated. On October 17th, a British drummer boy appeared on the ramparts waving a white handkerchief. 2 days later, on the 19th of October, 1781, roughly 8,000 British soldiers marched out and laid down their weapons. Cornwallis himself refused to attend the formal surrender ceremony, claiming illness, and sent a subordinate in his place. The most powerful military empire on the planet had just surrendered to a coalition of American farmers and French volunteers, and its commanding general could not even bring himself to look the victors in the eye. The young Frenchman who had helped close that trap was 24 years old. But here is the part of this story that most people never hear. And honestly, it is the part that I think matters the most. Because what happened to this man after Yorktown was not a happy ending. It was a tragedy that tested everything he believed in and revealed just how much deeper his convictions ran than anyone had ever imagined. When France erupted into its own revolution in 1789, he was at the center of it. Working alongside Thomas Jefferson, he helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that borrowed directly from the American Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Bill of Rights. He commanded the National Guard in Paris, and in a gesture loaded with profound symbolism, he sent the key to the Bastille prison, the fortress whose fall marked the beginning of the French Revolution, directly to George Washington at Mount Vernon, where it still hangs in the front hallway to this day. But the ideals he had fought for in America turned against him in his own country. Both the Royalists and the radical revolutionaries declared him a traitor. He fled France and was captured by Austrian forces, spending 5 brutal years in a dark, damp prison cell in Olmütz, with no adequate light, no decent food, and no knowledge of what was happening to his family back home. And what his wife endured during those years was, if anything, even more devastating. She was arrested in Paris in 1793. Her grandmother, her mother, and her sister were all taken to the guillotine and executed on the 22nd of July 1794, just days before the Reign of Terror finally ended. She herself had been condemned to die, and survived only because Robespierre had quietly removed her name from the daily death lists, fearing that her execution would damage relations with the still neutral United States. After her release, she did not retreat into safety. She petitioned the Austrian emperor directly, and then voluntarily walked into that same prison where her husband was being held, bringing their two youngest daughters with her, choosing captivity over the comfort of freedom without him. That is the kind of love and conviction that does not fit neatly into any history book. When he was finally released in 1797, biographers who saw him described a man whose hair had fallen out entirely, whose face resembled a cadaver more than a living person. Napoleon later restored his citizenship and offered to make him France's ambassador to America. He declined, saying that his affection for America ran so deep that he could not imagine sitting across a negotiating table from his own friends. When he returned to the United States in 1824 for what would become his farewell tour, 80,000 people, nearly two-thirds of the entire population of New York City, lined the streets of Broadway to welcome him. He visited all 24 states over 13 months. Elderly veterans of the Revolution, men in their 60s and 70s, wept openly at the sight of him. He became the first foreign leader in American history to address a joint session of Congress. He died on the 20th of May, 1834, at 76 years old. Soil from Bunker Hill was spread over his grave. And since the end of World War II, an American flag has flown at his gravesite in Paris, changed every year on the 4th of July, in a ceremony attended by officials from both nations. Nearly a century after his death, when American forces landed in France in 1917 to help turn the tide of the First World War, a colonel stood on French soil and spoke words that still echo today. "Lafayette, we are here." He was 19 when he defied a king. 19 when he took a musket ball at Brandywine. 20 when he endured Valley Forge. And 24 when he helped close the trap at Yorktown. America remembers its founding fathers, and it should. But it should also remember the young man from France who showed up uninvited, who bled for this country, who lost nearly everything in pursuit of the ideals he first discovered here, and who never once asked for anything in return. If this story moved you the way it moved me, drop a comment below and tell me which part hit you the hardest. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a great time to do that, because we have more stories like this one coming every single week, and you do not want to miss what is next.